Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Now, a few weeks ago, we gave you our predictions for the year. But what, for me, is far more interesting is the conversations we had that led us to those predictions. So come with us behind the curtain this week, where we give you all our thinking behind the predictions we made, so then you can decide whether you think we're on the right track or way off.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. It's that time of the week again where we step away from advising a multi-million pound property fund you can learn about at portfolio.co.uk and putting together hundreds of transactions on behalf of our clients and bringing you some of the knowledge and observations that we have made along the way. This episode is kind of part two in an informal trilogy because this is a time when it's really easy to misread the market and make decisions that in retrospect weren't the best. So we're covering some important topics at the moment. It's a good time to make sure that you're following the Property Podcast on Spotify or iTunes or wherever else to make sure you don't miss an episode, and to get yourself subscribed to our weekly newsletter, Property Pulse, where you can make sure that you're up to speed with all the week's big news stories in less than 5 minutes. It's completely free, so sign up at propertyhub.net/pulse. Our news story this week comes courtesy of Rightmove's latest house price index, which they put out just last week. And has a really interesting statistic in there. We've heard a lot about falling property prices recently, but asking prices have now risen by nearly 1%. Now, of course, this could just be New Year optimism. It doesn't mean that these prices are going to be achieved. But I think it's interesting that asking prices are increasing in a market when all the doom and gloom is very well known. I don't think anyone in the UK is feeling particularly encouraged about the economy or the housing market or anything right now. So who knows how this will play out. But I think it's interesting to have the Rightmove data in the mix because this is from the very beginning of the process when people are actually listing their properties. You've then got the ONS land registry data right at the end that's showing sales that have actually happened. And then in the middle, you've got the mortgage data from the likes of Nationwide and Halifax. So I think all of those worth keeping an eye on in the months to come to try and build up a picture of what's going on. The other point in there that I think was particularly interesting is that the demand from buyers is up by 55% compared to the 2 weeks before Christmas, which is not particularly surprising because that's always a quiet time of year. But 4% higher than 2019 is quite striking because, again, we've heard so much about the collapse in demand. And the collapse in demand is real, but it seems like it's only collapsed back down to where it was in 2019, in other words, like a normal market, and hasn't yet gone below that. So we'll link to this in the show notes and we'll be keeping a close eye on all of this in the weeks to come.
So before we get into the meat of our episode, a bit of a progress update I think is due, because a couple of weeks ago, we were able to share the wonderful news that Rob D has, which is that he's been signed up by Penguin to republish The Price of Money, an updated version, and they never say judge a book by its cover, but the new cover does look very, very good, has been available for pre-order. So once again, Rob, congratulations, amazing news. I don't think I'll get bored of congratulating you on this, but you've asked people to pre-order. You gave them an incredible incentive to pre-order rather than just getting the updated version of the book. So how's it going?
It's going super well, thank you. The book comes out on the 30th of March, but pre-orders are really important because they count towards the first week sales. And if you get enough first week sales, might just sneak into a bestseller list. You never know. So as a little reward for doing so, and to mean that you get a bit of instant gratification, you don't have to wait until March. Anyone who does pre-order gets instant access to a free video course that I've put together. It's about 90 minutes of video with me explaining some of the key concepts from the book. So it means that by the time March rolls around and that beautiful book lands on your doormat, you're going to get even more out of it because you've already had some of the key themes visually explained to you. So first of all, thank you to everyone who has pre-ordered. The publisher has been super impressed by it because they don't understand the power of the Property Podcast audience in the same way that we do. But if you haven't pre-ordered yet and you're interested in doing so and getting access to that course, then you can do that at priceofmoney.co.uk. Right, so we made some surprising predictions a couple of weeks back, and what we're going to do in this episode is explain why. And this, in my opinion, is far more important than the actual prediction itself, because the end result was a number. Anyone can come out with a number, and the only real consequence is we look clever or silly in 12 months' time. What matters is not the number itself, but how we arrived at it. because you may hear our number and you may strongly agree or you may very strongly disagree. But if you understand how we arrived at that decision and all the different factors that went into it, then it means you don't even have to have an opinion on our number, but you can decide how you personally weigh all these different factors, what you think is the most important, where you think our analysis has gone wrong or missed something, and come to your own view. Because that's what really matters. You shouldn't be investing based on what other people say, whether it's us or anyone else. You should be investing based on your own convictions. But by explaining the process that we went through, hopefully that will help you get to that place. So, Rob, I think a good starting point would be to remind anyone of what we did say and just how different that was from what seems to be the consensus this year.
So we said similar things. We weren't quite aligned, but we were nearly aligned. I felt the market would be at 2% growth this year, allowing for a 2% swing either way. So from 0 to 4%. And Rob, you said the market would go anywhere from -2 to +2%. But in the grand scheme of things, not a huge difference. And if you've not been following what everyone else has been saying around the market, you may feel that sounds quite sensible, not too risky. You could see a world where that happens. But yet, our predictions are in stark contrast to other property experts who put their views out. And I don't mean by 1 or 2%. I mean, quite a difference.
Yes, we're the most closely aligned with Rightmove. Rightmove's prediction for 2023 is -2%, but it's all more negative from there. So Zoopla has said -5%, Savills has said -10%, and Capital Economics, who you can always rely on to be gloomy, said -12%, and under a worst case scenario, as much as 20%.
Yeah, so putting Capital Economics aside, who are always quite wild with their predictions, a lot of the sort of household names, Halifax, Nationwide, Rightmove, all see bigger drops than we do. So is this because we're the property podcast and we are feeling optimistic and we want you to feel optimistic? Well, if you were cynical, you could feel that way. But you have to remember, all those reports are also based by people in the property industry who would rather see a more positive market than a negative one as well. So we all put our predictions out there. And actually, most years, we've done quite well when it comes to property predictions. But luckily, we're going to give you more than just a number. We're actually going to give you a lot more than just a number, because we want to take you through some of our conversations and the thinking we did to get to these numbers, which was quite a lot and more than we would normally do, because I think there's a lot more to consider this year than ever before. So, Rob, there's a long list of reasons why we've got to this point and got to these predictions. But to kick off the list of why we feel differently, I think, Rob, we have to start with inflation because it's had such a huge impact on all of our lives, both as individuals and, interacting with our economy. It's absolutely been rampant up until now. But we and experts across the board, pretty much every single economist and future data is pointing to falling inflation.
Yeah, I don't see how you could come to a different view on this, really, unless you really believe we're going to get into some kind of wage price spiral. But all the major shocks that have produced the really high inflation that we've seen, such as printing giant amounts of money in 2020 and supply chains and Ukraine and all the rest of it, have all happened. Therefore, inflation has to come down unless you get a whole range of new shocks that keep the rate high, because it's calculated based on a rate of change. So inflation is falling. Seems like it will fall further. But the reason, Rob, that's important is because of interest rates. I don't think it's controversial to say that the major reason for house prices going from rising pretty strongly to falling, as they have been recently, has been the fact that mortgages have become more expensive. And the reason that mortgages have become more expensive is that the base rate has increased. The Bank of England keeps on increasing the base rate. But with inflation falling, then the pace of rate rises will also slow, and a peak in rates might not actually be far away.
And what's really important about this is the fact it's slowed down. The back end of last year felt frantic. It felt like the government and the Bank of England didn't know what they were doing. It might be harsh. There might be a few of you chuckling and thinking, yeah, well, that's probably correct. But the way they acted really spooked the markets. You had different budgets coming out from our government. You had the Bank of England threatening to put rates up even between their monthly meeting that they have. It was difficult for the market to price in what was going to happen because it was very hard to think beyond just a few months' time. And because of that, it really destabilised pretty much all of our markets, we didn't know what to expect moving forward. This year seems a lot more predictable because the world is a bit more stable than last year. And it feels like the Bank of England have kind of given us enough of a shock and our economy enough of a shock to slow down inflation. And maybe they've done enough to tackle it completely. So will we see some more rate rises this year? Probably. Will they be drastic? No. And will that then give more confidence to the markets? Absolutely. And Rob, confidence in the markets and some sort of stability and at least the feeling of being able to predict what's ahead makes a huge difference to the property market because that impacts mortgage rates.
Definitely. Mortgage rates are dependent on a few different things. So they're dependent on what the base rate is today. They're also dependent on what the markets believe rates are likely to be in the future for fixed rates. And they're dependent on the sentiment of lenders. How nervous are they? How competitive do they want to be? How much capacity have they got to take on new borrowers? And all of those turned bad in the last quarter of last year. So today's rates went up. Expectations of future rates went up, and their willingness and capacity to make new loans decreased because they were just all over the place because everything was happening so quickly that lenders were having to constantly reprice their products, take them off the market, reprice them, put them back on. And every time they did that, because everyone was in a panic and lots of people were trying to go and get new deals because they were really worried about what was going to happen, they would get bombarded with demand, and that was making it hard for them to maintain their service level. So again, they'd have to pull back. All of that is reversing. And I think that the underestimated one of those is what we'll call the sentiment of the lenders. Their margins are still pretty high at the moment. And I think that's because they're still somewhat in shock about everything that's happened. But now, as you've said, stability has returned. That'll start to come down over time. They'll go from this kind of siege mentality, we just need to get through this scenario and we need to be really careful because we don't know what's going to happen. They'll go back to where they were before, which is they want to be competitive. They want to do business. They're going to start competing with each other. I think a major negative shock to the market was what happened with mortgages, and it's not going to spring back to where it was. I don't think in terms of rates, it's going to get back to where it was for many, many years. But I think it's something that we're going to see gradually improve throughout the year.
Absolutely. And it will become the new normal. We've said previously on the podcast that interest rates needed to go up for the benefit of the economy because one of the levers you have in a major recession or crash is reducing interest rates. Well, if that had happened, then we had nowhere to go. So interest rates have risen, and you could argue, and we would argue, that that is a good thing, actually. Now, at the rate they went up, we would definitely say that wasn't a good thing. It was absolutely rapid and felt, as I've said, frantic. But that craziness has subsided. Things have stabilised. The margins, so the amount that the lenders borrow at, and then they put their margin on top, that margin will reduce this year over time. Competition, the market settling down, we'll see to that. In a way, things were so bad at the back end of last year that they can only improve. So the mortgage market improving and lenders having more confidence will have a huge impact on the property market moving forward this year. And it's not just the sentiment of the mortgage market, but the sentiment of the UK as a whole is really important as well. If you look at some of the big consumer confidence indexes, they show that sentiment in the UK and how people felt about the UK economy at the back end of last year was at a major low. Lower, in fact, than how people felt after the 2008 crash, which is quite bizarre, really. But it was a bit of a frantic, scary time. So maybe not that hard to understand. But it looks like it's bottomed out, and sentiment has been improving since November. So again, people are starting to feel better about the UK economy, albeit from a really low point, but it is improving. And as people generally feel better, a sentiment amongst individuals and businesses improve, that will also lead to seeing the economy improve. And if the economy is improving, then the property market will tend to improve as well. So sentiment is super important. And one of the reasons, Rob, that sentiment could be improving is not just because it's January, New Year, and we're all feeling fresh and ready to go, but actually the recession that we've been told is going to be a long and not nice one might not be as bad as we'd all feared after all.
That's right. So the latest data that we spoke about on a recent market update shows that the economy actually grew in November, which is the latest month for which there are figures, only by 0.1%, but is expected to shrink And let's be honest, if it was actually falling by 0.1 instead of rising by 0.1, you wouldn't even notice. It seems to me that we're not necessarily going to have a long but shallow recession, which is what most people seem to be expected. I think we'll just have a pretty protracted period of no growth. So rather than having a long technical recession, so GDP is always falling, I think you'll probably see it sort of like being down a bit, up a bit, down a bit, up a bit. So it's not going to be great times, but it's something that people can very easily live with and get used to. And I think that play into the sentiment they've just been talking about. And also, Rob, a big reason that recession is seen as so damaging is that if people are spending less and companies are struggling, then people are going to lose their jobs. And if people are worried about losing their jobs, then they're going to rein in their spending, which is going to make the situation even worse. But in fact, the job market is still strong. It's not as wild as it was, say, 6 months back, where it was just almost impossible to hire people because there are so many job vacancies and so few job hunters. But I would say, in both my subjective experience and looking at the data, the job market is still very strong. So I can't see that there'd be a lot of people out there sort of fearful of losing their jobs or actually losing their jobs, which of course might put them in a situation where they need to sell their house, which would be negative for house prices.
Yeah, last year was wild, but the job market is still ridiculously strong. Bearing in mind how grim things were in November and December, unemployment decreased further from 4.4 to 4.3%, even though it felt like the world was falling apart, or at least the UK was falling apart anyway. So for that to happen in those conditions just shows you the strength of the labour market right now. So will this year be as strong as last year? No. But is there suddenly going to be a load of unemployment? No. And if everybody feels like the jobs are secure, then they'll make decisions based on that. Like you've said, Rob, that's a huge thing. It's how people feel about the security of their jobs and therefore how they can behave and act with the wider economy. And at the moment, the numbers are the strongest they've been for years and years and years. You don't really hear the media talk about that because it sounds like a positive news story. So why would you want to report on it? But that's the data. And that, amongst a lot of what we've discussed so far, has a big influence on why we feel our predictions are in the right range this year. But what's really interesting, Rob, is let's just say it does go downhill a little bit and things don't go so well for the economy. You've got a bit of a protection layer here, and that's going to be a lack of forced sales happening.
That's right. So if you think back to the last major downturn of 2008, the event that actually precipitated all of that was in the US, where the subprime market imploded. And that was basically because loans were made to people who couldn't pay them back. And when it became clear that they couldn't pay them back and their homes started getting repossessed, that put the banks under major pressure and set in process everything that came afterwards. In the UK specifically, things hadn't got as out of control and interest rates came right down very quickly, which meant that you didn't get as many forced sales as you might have expected. But there was still quite a lot because people had been making some pretty optimistic purchases and ended up having those properties repossessed. You could say mortgage rates have really spiked, and a lot of that isn't really showing up yet because people have been on fixed rates. When those fixed rates end, they're going to be in real trouble. And that may be true. But the thing you have to remember is that the government really doesn't want a house price crash, and they really don't want loads of people to lose their homes. There are many, many reasons for that to be the case. We don't need to get into them all now. But the point is, when they can keep the market going, they will. So one thing they've already done is spoken to the major lenders and asked them to show forbearance to people who do fall into arrears to try to prevent any of those forced sales from happening. They have it in their power to make even more direct interventions if they need to. There's talk of other governments around the world doing this. And I think they would do it if it looked like things were going that way. But I don't think that'll be necessary. Because even though when people come to the end of fixed rates, their mortgage payments will have potentially gone up a lot, I think individual lenders will be willing to help them out either by giving them some kind of grace period or by extending the loan or finding some other way of making it more affordable. And I think the basis on which mortgages are being made is completely different from how it was coming up to 2008. There's quite a lot of protection already built in. It's not been long enough that all the lessons of the previous crash have already been forgotten. So the underwriting is better, the stress tests are more robust. So as a result, I don't believe, Rob, we're going to see waves and waves of repossessed property coming onto the market, flooding the market with stock that needs to be sold quickly and therefore depressing prices. So there are other reasons that may depress prices in the year ahead, but for me, that's not one of them. You might not know it, but in the background to this podcast, we run a business called Property Hub Invest that helps investors build portfolios. We use relationships that we have with some of the UK's best developers to secure properties at a discount and make the whole process super hands-off. So if you want to invest in high-quality properties for the long term and not take up any of your time doing it, then you can check out Property Hub Invest at propertyhub.net/invest.
So you may think, well, guys, it's pretty compelling. I'm on board. Some of you may even think we've gone too low on our predictions. Who knows? But let's get to the big counter here. And there is a big counter. There's one that sits above all others. And that's a simple one. And that's that mortgage rates have gone up. And if mortgage rates have gone up, that means people may potentially be less inclined to take action or just can't afford to take action because now their mortgages will cost more if they make a purchase. So, Rob, that's a pretty strong counter to, albeit a long list of reasons why we feel our predictions are right. But if we had the other experts on, this would be what they'd be pointing to and saying, well, this is why we think our numbers are right.
Yeah, and I think that's entirely fair. I think it's reasonable to say that is such a big factor that it could comfortably outweigh everything that we've just spoken about. Because even if mortgage rates don't go up any further from here, they've already gone up so much that we haven't seen all of that reflected in the market yet. So I think they would say, well, property prices have been falling for 4 months now, but they've got further to go. The sharp adjustment upwards in rates hasn't been reflected in current prices yet. Therefore, prices will continue to fall throughout the year and you'll start to hit those falls 5%, 8%, 12%, whatever people have come up with. But while I think that there's a lot of truth in that, I think this is where you have to get beneath the average. So everything we've been talking about has been relating to the UK average. Prices going up or down by 2% across the UK as a whole on average. But that average is made up of lots and lots of individual transactions, which includes different property types and different areas. And I think that this year you are going to see property prices falling in some areas. But you're also going to see property prices rising in some areas and some types of property. And it's by combining all those and taking the average that you get to the big number. So, for example, Rob, I think it's almost inevitable, I don't see how it couldn't happen, that prices will fall in London this year. Because prices in London already very high, affordability already very stretched. It's going to be very hard to justify what you would have done last year for a property in London today. But there are other parts of the country where the outlook is completely different, where affordability is actually pretty good. And in those areas, lots of these other factors that we've talked about, I think, are going to be more influential than what's happened with the rates. So that's just one example. I've got others as well. But for me, that's where you need to start looking. You need to get away from this point about the UK average and start digging into what's happening at a local level and start to dig into what's happening in different parts of the country, different property types in more detail.
That's right, Rob, and I completely agree with your view on London. But we are really optimistic about certain areas of the UK. And when we've picked out our hotspots this year, they are in a really good place. The macro reasons for why we believe those places to perform strongly are there and ever present. And we've listed them off before. We've given you the reasons why we've picked out places like Manchester, Greater Manchester, Derby, Leeds, etc. For me, it's not hard to see those areas ending up in the positive this year. But it is a real mix. And it's not just a mix of the areas, Rob, as well. But what's really interesting is you can take this a step further and not just look at different areas, but also look at the different types of properties that you can go and buy this year. And Rob, you've got an interesting view on the market of what type of property will perform well this year.
Yeah, I think if you take this point about the fact that mortgage rates have gone up so much, therefore it's going to affect how much you're willing to pay for something, you have to think, well, which kind of property is that going to affect the most? And for me, the answer to that is those properties that people have bought in just the last couple of years, where prices have gone up the most and people will have been stretching themselves the most and taking advantage of low mortgage rates to do that. And that is houses, larger houses, houses with gardens, and in areas that are a little bit more rural. It's that race for space that everyone was talking about after COVID. If you look at the difference in prices between houses and apartments, houses have risen in value far more quickly than apartments over the last couple of years, far more than usual because of that effect, which means that those are the very properties that are now vulnerable to having prices fall. Because again, if you think back to 2008, everyone was getting super carried away and paying huge amounts of money for anything and not thinking too much about the consequences. Has that been happening in the last couple of years? Well, I think you could say that there's been certainly frothy markets in certain places in the last couple of years. Those all have been for the type of property that I just described. Therefore, I think that's where you're more likely to see prices come down. New buyers now are not going to be willing to pay what they were a year ago. But in other parts of the market, like apartments in city centres that no one was interested in at all for those couple of years, but where now you're seeing massive rent increases, those rent increases now make those properties far more attractive as investments. So I think you'll see a situation where city centre apartments, for example, will perform pretty strongly while larger houses struggle. So again, Rob, it comes back to this point about the average. All of these different things come together to make up the average. And that means a couple of things. It means that actually, when you're buying or making decisions about what you're going to do with your portfolio this year, you should be more concerned about the individual case because you're not buying the average. And the other point is I believe that some of these more negative forecasts are perhaps taking what's going to happen with just some parts of the market and extrapolating it out to the whole market. I don't know, we may well be wrong on this, but I think it's possibly another of those cases where people take London and think that London is the whole country. It's not. And I think that there's a lot more variability and nuance in there than perhaps some people are considering.
Okay, so we've given you a lot here. So let's try and map this out. If we bring all this into play, how could this impact the year? And Rob, I've got a view on how the year will perform and how it will look. Risky, right? Because it's bad enough saying that, okay, this is how the year will end. But then to say, and this is how it will get there, yeah, I'm probably setting myself up for a fall. But as I said at the top of the show, we've given this a lot of thought. So I feel Q1 will be the worst quarter this year. It'll be the most negative. The numbers will be the worst. And that will be the bottom. So that'll be as bad as it gets in Q1. I think Q2 will be better. Not a lot better, but I think it will be better. I think it's worth saying that the reason Q1 will be so bad, a lot of the data and negativity around the numbers at the back end of last year have still got to come through and be reported. Most property numbers are lagging. So I think Q1 really will be bad because of that. Q2 will then be more of a reflection of how Q1 went because of that lagging effect. And I think it will start to look a bit better. But really, the best part of this year, in terms of numbers, and I feel this is for the property market and economy as a whole, will be in the second half of this year. So we will see. But that's how I see it mapped out. Rob, do you think I've lost the plot by going into this level of detail? Or do you feel different? Or are you in a similar place? Where are you at with this?
I agree. And I actually think it's quite important because we feel confident about our predictions. But I've already said we might be wrong. And I think if we are wrong, it's going to be because of timing. I don't think that we've completely misread the market, but it may be that what you've got down as a negative Q1 may turn out to be negative for half the year. And then the turnaround to things getting better might take longer than you expected. So I think the pattern that you've outlined, I'm in complete agreement with. I think if we do see prices come down by, say, 5% this year, which is what some commentators are predicting, then I think it's because that negative part will have lasted longer. So I think this is a timing thing more than anything. And it's tricky because if you're out by even 3 months, then that throws your prediction for the year completely off. But I think in terms of the sequence you've laid out, I completely agree.
So let's ramp this up further, because whether the market drops 5% or grows 4% or somewhere in between, what the market is not doing this year is reflecting the 18-year property cycle. And Rob, it didn't last year. It started to look like it was on track because we were expecting a boom year last year, and the first half of the year delivered on that. But then, as we've discussed, things changed. And this year, let's just say somewhere in the middle, and it's around, let's just say no growth this year. We were expecting, according to the 18-year property cycle, a boom this year. So there's probably a lot of people asking, well, what does this mean for the 18-year property cycle? And where is the boom gone?
We need to talk about the cycle. I don't think we can avoid it. The cycle would not have led you towards what happened last year, and it would not have led you towards what will happen this year. Whether we're right or everyone else is right, the cycle still would have made you think differently. So what does that mean? Does it mean that this whole way of thinking about the world that we've been using for the last goodness knows how many years is just wrong? It might do.
Well, like any true good series, Rob, you should have a cliffhanger. And that is our cliffhanger, because that's next week's topic. We are going to ask the question, what has happened to the 18-year property cycle, and is it broken? And that will make for a fascinating episode, because we have to look at what's happening, and maybe we have to tear up the 18-year property cycle, or maybe there's hope for it yet. Well, next week, we're going to dig in, and we're going to discuss, and we're going to, of course, give you our views.
So there's been a lot in this episode, but still time for a little bit more in the form of Hub Extra, where we give you a little resource or tool to send you away in a slightly better place than when you joined us. And this week, I'm delighted to be sharing a resource that's not just recommended by a listener, but created by a listener. So shout out to Tobias for sending this our way. We've spoken in the past about the train line as a means of booking your rail trips, because they've got a feature where if you split your journey in two and the price of those two individual legs is cheaper, they'll apply that for you and save you money. But Tobias and his team has created Split My Fare, splitmyfare.co.uk. It's now available as an app for both iOS and Android that he says does a better job of this. As you can tell by the name, it's specifically built around this idea of saving you money by splitting fares. It's not just an extra little thing that they've layered on top. And as a result, he says that it finds more savings for you more of the time. And even if it doesn't do that and it's the same, then they don't charge a booking fee where the train line does. So I'm going to put this to the test. I've got a trip to Manchester coming up next week. I'm going to see how Split My Fare gets on for me. I'm sure it'll be able to save me a bit. But I'm really happy to have this extra tool in my train booking arsenal because, let's face it, they are ludicrously expensive without. And really happy to be supporting something that a listener has put together as well. So do check out splitmyfare.co.uk.
Sounds awesome. I'm going to download that now, Rob. So plenty to keep you busy with until we return. So until then, have fun. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.